Good morning. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Human Progress and Flourishing Workshop. In this workshop, we bring in scholars from across the country and from NDSU to present their research and engage in a discussion with the NDSU community. Topics focus on innovation, opportunity, and ways to increase individual and societal flourishing. I'm really excited today that we're joined by Dr. Alfredo Roa-Henriquez, who is originally from Colombia and then came here in January when it was below zero. So he's a very hardy individual. He stuck it out, and I'm super glad that you did. And he's going to present on supply chain resilience today. So Alfredo Roa-Henriquez is an assistant professor of logistics in the Department of Transportation, Logistics, and Finance, and a scholar with the Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth at North Dakota State University. His research interests include the resilience of businesses and supply chains, organizational economics, and the intersection of behavioral economics and supply chain management. He also studies business-government interactions, regulation and deregulation, and business ethics and sustainability. Before joining NDSU, he was a postdoctoral scholar in the Applied Economics Office at the National Institute of Standards and Technology at Johns Hopkins University. He received his PhD in public policy and management from the Ohio State University. And again, I'm super excited that Alfredo is here today. And could everyone please give a warm round of welcome to Alfredo.
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone for being here in this presentation. So I am Alfredo Roa-Henriquez, and I will be presenting on the role of a resource sharing tactic in the context of disasters and the COVID-19 pandemic. Before actually starting the presentation, I would like to pose like a couple of questions. The first is, how so frequent do we see large companies go out of business after a major disruption? What do you guys think about this? Yeah. And the other is, how so frequent do we see small companies all the time, right? So what are the reasons that we might consider that large companies don't go out of business very frequently? Have more resources? Financially, right? So there are some characteristics that we might understand that allow businesses or large corporations to stay, and that is actually reflected in even not only academically, but also in some news. So when we see news related to how businesses, large corporations cope with disruptions versus small businesses, so we see that there are some factors that maybe have led to large corporations to navigate uncertainty, right? So in general, we say that large businesses maybe have achieved supply chain resilience and have embraced some risk management practices that have led them to navigate uncertainty more frequently than small businesses. So does that imply that small businesses are not resilient? Not necessarily. And that's what we are going to be looking at today. So why study small businesses? Well, this is a profile of small businesses in the US in 2021. So we know that small businesses are basically an engine of the economy. So we have in the US 32.5 million small businesses. The 99.9% of businesses are small, and those employ 61 million people, right? And are the 46% of US employees. In North Dakota, even that proportion is higher. So the profile in 2021 is around 75,000 small businesses, and even 98% of them are small, and those make for 56.7% of North Dakota employees. So small businesses are important, and we need to learn basically how to these companies face uncertainty and or how they cope with disruptions. So in order to do this, we are going to explore some concepts associated to supply chain resilience, business resilience, and research sharing. So last week, we had a presentation here from Dr. Noah Dormady from Ohio State, and he spoke about business resilience. I will be extending a little bit on that presentation for those who came here. For those who don't attended that presentation, I will provide some initial concepts too. So what do we understand for supply chain resilience, or by supply chain resilience? So basically, supply chain resilience is associated with a set of capabilities that allow a supply chain network to prepare, respond, and recover from major disruptions while maintaining some connectedness and maintaining continuity in their operations. More recently, the concept of supply chain resilience has been also associated with adaptability. And these capabilities basically can be achieved by creating some redundancies and some flexibilities in the network that can be costly for the organizations, right? Some of them usually are justified when they create competitive advantage, or when they say they create competitive advantage. Other capabilities also include some visibility and some velocity, basically, which require a high level of coordination and collaboration. How to measure, in this case, the supply chain resilience? Usually, the studies use complicated measures that aim to establish the reliability of the network, and complex stress tests that basically assess potential network failures. So the point in time in which we measure the supply chain resilience is basically before the disruption occurs. Now, in terms of economic resilience, what is economic resilience? Is the ability of the business to maintain functioning while using resources efficiently, and by using tactics that result from the implementation of actions that are inherently built into the business or can be adapted by the business. Some example of these tactics include conservation, technological change, excess capacity, in which sometimes businesses just bring in line assets that have not been used previously or at all in the company. Some metrics to measure economic resilience are associated to avoided losses. And we can also measure business resilience with the metric, the benefit cost ratio, in which we have the proportion of avoided losses over the maximum potential losses. But one way to explore this is looking at the avoided losses, or what we call business interruption. The difference between business resilience or economic resilience is that we measure this after the disruption occurs, as opposed to before the disruption. So after looking at business resilience, in which we can implement some actions or some different tactics, I became interested in one particular tactic that we call resource sharing. This called my attention when while I was doing my PhD, because this idea that businesses try to control their external environment, try to control their resources, and try to cope with uncertainty by controlling resources from their external environment. So one way to do this is what happens after disruptions. Do businesses actually, how they cope, how do the businesses cope with this control of resources after the external environment? And there are some actions embedded in the resource sharing tactic that aims to hasten recovery through mechanisms such as bargaining, selective exchange of resources, creating new partnerships, or joint ventures. So in this case, the resilience is measured in terms of avoiding losses, representing the level of avoided interruption or disruption. So in order to test the level of resilience of small businesses, we implemented several surveys. The first two surveys that I will discuss are associated to measuring the resilience of businesses after Superstorm Sandy and Hurricane Harvey. So this is the resilience of business to disasters. So the survey methodology, these were surveys funded by the Department of Homeland Security. Firms affected by or firms selected were affected by business interruption or property damage, were predominantly small and medium-sized businesses, and were administered 60 months and 30 months respectively after the disaster or post-disaster. We stratify basically firms by size and property damage, and the sample after cleaning the survey, we remain with 249 firms that employ more than 1,000 tactics, including resource sharing. So some empirical results. So we see here that we see these are the types of disruptions that businesses experience, and we categorize those by sectors. We see that supply chain was mostly or affected mostly on manufacturing firms, right? So these are the types of disruptions that we initially explore in this survey. Here, then we look at those businesses that implement the resource sharing versus those businesses that didn't implement resource sharing. So we try to aggregate this here and see some what we call ecological fallacy by aggregating or by analyzing the unit of analysis. It seems to be that businesses that didn't use resource sharing initially had a lower level of business interruption than businesses that implement the resource sharing. However, when we explore this by sectors, this changed a little bit. So when we explore, for instance, for manufacturing firms, we see that manufacturing firms that didn't implement the resource sharing actually experience a high level of disruption in terms of their supply chains that businesses that implement the resource sharing, for instance. So there are other classifications too in terms of other sectors, the transportation, communication, and utilities. So we see that also businesses, manufacturing firms, in this, these businesses experience the transportation and communities and utilities business experience a higher degree of supply chain disruptions than those businesses that did not implement the tactic, basically. That's the opposite in this case for the wholesale and retail, right? And so this allows us to provide some results. And the first result is that in order to obtain estimates for this survey, we implemented a Heckman model that allows us to estimate the effects of resource sharing tactic on the level interruption that was avoided. Using this strategy, it's important to minimize endogeneity issues due to sample selection. Using this strategy also suggests that selecting a tactic is an endogenous decision depending on observed characteristics. And some conservative estimates after implementing this model indicates that those businesses that implemented the tactics were 3 times more likely to avoid losses in comparison to those businesses that did not implement the tactic. We see that there are some unobserved characteristics that affect these results, and that's why we are using this kind of method, a Heckman model, to come up with these results. So other survey that we implemented was a survey to study the resilience of businesses in the COVID-19 pandemic. So basically, this survey was implemented to analyze or to study how past experiences of businesses with natural disasters could help to adapt during the COVID-19. So basically, the survey methodology, the objective was to understand experiences of small and medium-sized businesses with natural disasters in the context of COVID-19. We included questions related to how COVID-19 impacted small and medium enterprises and how these adapted to those impacts. And the survey was disseminated in counties with natural disaster experience. Within each county, businesses were random sampled, basically to ensure heterogeneity in potential disaster experience. And this, to use this random sampling, we use what we call the Sheldus database that contains the disaster experience of businesses since 1960. We also use a non-probability sample, what we call a convenience sample, a secondary source of data collection, just to compare those businesses located in counties not experienced disaster versus those located in counties having experienced disaster. The data or the information of businesses were collected with information provided by USB's data. So some results. Well, the survey methodology, sorry, there were 1,374 survey responses in this survey. 1,357 businesses provided location information. 1,100 businesses respondents identified their businesses are either essential or non-essential, and 930 respondents provided information about their industry sector, like some general aspects of the survey methodology. So some results. This is where most of the collected information comes from. In the South, we got 52 of the responses, and these are the census regions. The Northeast, we have 11% of responses. In the Midwest, 15%, and in the West, 22%. So we got most of the responses from the South, given that most businesses have experienced disaster in that region. When we look at the percentage of businesses that have experienced disasters in the past 10 years, we see that 89% of businesses located in the South reported having experienced disasters. Around 87% of businesses in the Northeast reported having experienced disasters. 80% in the Midwest and 74% in the South. Among the questions that we included, so we asked businesses, how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the continuity stability of your business by sector? So we also disaggregate this by some industry sectors, and we ask businesses how they have been impacted by some factors, or if they have been impacted in terms of closing for less than 4 weeks, closing for 4 weeks or longer, if they had on-site operations ceased by remaining staff teleworked, if they had reduced days, hours of operations, increased commerce, remain fully open to the public, added services, or decreasing revenue. So what we see here is that generally the service businesses were the most affected in general in all metrics, right? Some manufacturing businesses closed for less than 4 weeks. Some reported having closed for longer than 4 weeks. But in general, we can see that, as we know, this affected most the service industry. In other question, we ask businesses to describe any changes that they used to adapt to those types of disruptions or this type of disruption. And we see that among the measures that businesses use to adapt, we ask about some resource sharing actions. These resource sharing actions include if businesses had negotiated longer payment terms for suppliers, or had renegotiated current and future prices with suppliers, or had exchanged information with other organizations, or implemented short-term alliances. So what we see is that in general, also the businesses that reported being in the service industry were more prone to, in this case, to use the resource sharing tactic too, as we can see here in terms of frequency of businesses. Okay, some results. To get some estimates of the influence of the resource sharing tactic in the how the resource sharing tactic helped businesses to navigate the disruption of COVID-19, we use different logic models, what we call different logic models, to estimate the effect of this on different impact variables. For the identification, we use a parsimonious structure of resource sharing. We use a principal component factor analysis, what we call, to use and extract the factors. Some of the items were greater than 0.5 and loaded around a unique factor. And we have some variables that incorporate and control in this model, including size, age, disaster experience, types of disasters. And some estimates suggest that those businesses that resource share were nearly 1.5 times more likely to remain open to the public and 30% less likely to experience a revenue decrease in comparison to businesses that did not employ this tactic. So actually, this indicates that businesses have some experience and have learned how to navigate some disruptions, as is indicated in these results. Some future research ideas. So business resilience is actually a relatively new topic. We still don't know why businesses don't use some tactics when even they have the resources to do it. So we can still explore the mechanisms that lead some businesses to use some tactics instead of the others. This is something that might be used in the domain of behavioral economics and try to explain why this occur in business resilience. The surveys that we implemented are actually among the first surveys that try to collect information and try to explain business resilience, how businesses use actions or how adapt in the face of uncertainty, basically to cope with multiple disruptions. In the COVID-19 survey, we try to cover different risks, or what we call compound risks, to establish how businesses have used that experience with natural disaster and cope with those possible multiple risks. It is still an ongoing effort of how businesses can cope with disasters and try to understand how businesses create capabilities to cope with these disruptions. And more research on exploring the drivers behind making strategic decisions in post-disaster contexts. So we still need to know what are the transmission mechanisms, as I suggested before, what are the transmission mechanisms, or what are the reasons that lead some businesses to make some strategic choices instead of others. Thank you. Yes, Sandra. I am going to again take the presentation here. Yes. So yes, so the question is some examples of resource sharing. So there are some examples that I'm going to go to definition of resource sharing. So resource sharing embeds different things. And one of these is, for instance, bargaining. So we say that how businesses try to renegotiate supply contracts after disruptions. That is one possibility. Other is this type of short-term agreements. Try to exchange some critical resources needed by some businesses and needed for others. Or even try to create new partnerships in the face of disruption. There are some, in some countries in which after disruptions, there are some special bids, offers, types of procurement activities that are designed specifically for small businesses so they can cope with those disruptions in specific zones, specific areas. So these kind of things help businesses to recover and are particular types of policies aimed at designing that. Okay.
So would an example be like in the service industry, would it be that restaurants were creating partnerships with Uber Eats and all these food deliveries?
For example, that would be an example in the COVID-19, like how all these services, in this case restaurants, created some partnerships with these other companies, tech companies like Uber, right, to hasten the delivery, and how they created some mechanisms for a last mile delivery, for instance. So it's an important part. Yeah.
So okay, so I have a question. So do you think, so you talked about how experience, the companies that were experienced with natural disasters did better in terms of resilience tactics. So do you think that because we've all been kind of exposed to this disaster of the COVID-19 pandemic, do you think that in the future that there's going to be better resilience, better economic resilience, you know, for anything that happens because of the experience that businesses have?
So we know that businesses learn from the past, and the idea of this research was precisely to incorporate that that variable, like how experience with disasters could help businesses or had helped businesses to cope with disruption, with the COVID-19 disruption. So we would expect in general that businesses now have more tools that allow them to navigate this kind of uncertainty. So we would expect they are more prepared, but there is always something that might be uncertain, right? So in general, what we know from this research is that businesses that have used some tactics have coped with disruption better than those who hadn't used the tactic, right? And we expect that they are better prepared, but also depends if they choose to use the tactic or not. basically.
So you mentioned a good point, like why you ask a question like at the end of the slide, like why some businesses do not use this resource sharing tactics. And you talk about behavioral economics, but in my mind, it just if you could give insight, put regulations like a local regulations that the state level or county level could be a hindrance to resource sharing practice. Maybe this regulation will not allow firms to cooperate with that. They might be doing a monopoly, something like that.
Yeah, the question is that if the regulations put in place prevent businesses to use some tactics,
Yeah.
right? And we didn't study the effect of regulations specifically in this survey, so I wouldn't say yes or no because we didn't ask specifically about regulations or specifically about that. But some businesses maybe might use one tactic instead of the other because they consider that tactic might be suitable for them, but that is not necessarily what actually is functioning, right? So the idea with this is try to collect empirical data and show and try to profile those businesses that are more likely to use and gain with that tactic instead of others. Basically.
And another thing, like if you look at the sample, like your sampling is like you sampling county that have experience of natural disasters, and it looked like very homogeneous, like similar, like different regions seem to have very similar percentage that they experience. But when it comes to like answering the sample, your questions, it's like firm in the South tend to answer more of the questions. So are you worried about sampling selection bias?
Yeah, so with it, like in the survey for the COVID, we did this on purpose. So basically, I don't. It's here. So we did this on purpose. So the idea was to collect information more from those businesses that had experienced disaster because that was what we wanted to document, right? So, but we also released that survey to those businesses located in counties that had not experienced disaster, what we call a convenience sample, and just to try to make that comparison, right?
Example like the Western California is definitely locked down, and some areas in New York are also facing lockdown, but Florida is not facing lockdown. But the majority of your survey results come from Florida. Not the business there is pretty much open.
Yeah. Yeah. So it also depends. We receive more responses from some states than others, right? So but initially, yes, we released that survey basically to 28 states that had suffered most of the disasters, and that's the difference in the sample, basically. Okay.
We also don't live in a state where natural disasters are common. So what would you expect for North Dakota residents to take away?
Okay, so I'm going to this and this is let me put this again. Okay, so the question is if North Dakota doesn't experience like natural disasters, what can we take from this, right?
Yeah,
Or we're prone to disasters. Okay, so actually the largest effect of climate change on the state is in terms of droughts and flooding, right? So there are some effects, maybe at the local level, in some specific sectors, right? And not necessarily because we experience natural disasters, it doesn't mean that we are not going to experience other type of disaster as COVID. So learning to navigate any type of disruption is important. And in this case, well, we know that maybe we are not analyzing some natural disasters in the area, but it's likely that COVID hit, right, to some particular businesses. Some businesses closed, although the last report that I read indicated that actually during the first year of pandemic, where there were 200,000 additional closures above the average number in the country. In the first year of pandemic in the state were created 1,200 additional businesses, right? So this indicates that maybe businesses in the state have good resilience or have learned to navigate some uncertainties with some specific policies, right? But resilience is a process, and just learning to cope with this type of disruptions, not necessarily disaster, but also other types of disruptions like the COVID, is important for all the population.
But blizzard, we call blizzard as a disaster as well. Natural, is it blizzard like?
Yeah, well, we categorize some of the specific disasters, and those are categorized in the shelters by shelters also. So, but in terms of some impacts of disasters, might have effects on some particular types of businesses.
I have two questions. So one is, so when you're talking about resource sharing, right? So businesses sharing their resources, but the businesses they're resource sharing with, are they producing complementary products or substituted products, right? Because businesses are inherently competitive. Like if I'm operating a restaurant, if other restaurants go out of businesses, I'll have more, share, right? That'll be different from like the example that John brought up, which is having collaborating with Uber or something like that, right? Do you distinguish those two?
No, we don't make that difference here. We assume that businesses will compete, right? But also are prone to collaborate. Just as I mentioned, based on this idea that they try to control or stabilize the flow of resources, product derived from the external environment. So that's one way of putting it here. But yeah, we don't control for that.
Second, thank you. Second question has to do with.
Can you speak up, please?
Yeah.
Okay. The second question has to do with the magnitude of disasters. So what I mean is, like, there's a lot of, I'm looking at social impacts of disasters, economic impacts of disasters, and what I've consistently found in the literature and in my own work is most disasters, it's just a function of data collection. We're just getting really good at collecting data. So if you just look at number of disasters, with everything's a disaster, right? So in the data. So when you look at the fatality rate or the damages, you see a lot of spikes in very, very rare events, and those spikes are the ones that have lasting economic impacts, lasting social impacts, right? So experience with disaster, do you distinguish between experience with,
Yeah.
Snow in Texas, that could be a disaster.
Yeah. So experience with disasters, we ask businesses to report the number of disasters they experienced in the last 10 years.
Yeah. So but that doesn't global disasters, and is it something that's reported?
Yeah, so because we are also controlling by some disasters, and we categorize that. I have not included like all details here, but we have those, and those are specifically in the literature known like chronic disasters versus acute disasters. So those that are frequently repeated versus those that are more broad in time, that happen sporadically. So, and we try to control for those, and we classify those by being chronic or being acute. I haven't included specifically those in the presentation. Just try to provide some general impacts, but yeah, we are controlling for those too. Yeah.
Question from a team having all of the professors keep resilience times goes into financial efficiency. So we emphasize very lean operations, very financial operations. How do we adjust our teaching to teach our students building more resilience and compromising the rebalancing? Well, maybe that's not necessarily.
Yeah, the question is how do we compromise the like teaching resilience versus teaching financial efficiency, right? And that is a good question. I at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned how this supply chain resilience that has been embraced by large corporations in part. On the one hand, it is assumed to imply higher costs, because by creating redundancies or creating flexibilities, practically you are including higher costs in the organization, right? Some of them, it is said that might be justified if that creates competitive advantage for the company, right? So in part, if that creates competitive advantage, it means that resilience is a gain, because it implies that you might be gaining a higher market share, right? So that in part, it implies that resilience is paying off, right? Sometimes, however, resilience might be a cost when you have some redundancy in the system, but actually it is something that it's a kind of insurance, right? And it is a trade-off, it's a balance that we should need to learn how to implement that in the company, how to implement that in the organization. Okay. Yeah.
I have three questions. The first one, I see some quantification of impact on the business in multiple aspects. So how can you get no percentage? If you just ask them in the survey and ask the business then to quantify the impact by themselves, or by somebody to impact that.
Okay, so how the quantification works? So you mean here in the like this impacts? So yeah, so we ask businesses specifically in this question, for instance, we ask businesses what percentage of disruption they achieve specifically. Yeah, so this is a survey, and survey research, when we ask people there might be some aspects that we need to control for, and we need to analyze the surveys just to see if the responses might be biased in one way or another, right? So what we usually do to see if there are biases is, on the one hand, trying to compare this with some other surveys already established in the literature or that have been carried out before, just to see if results might diverge or it might be similar in some way. And that's one way to do this. So in this case, we know, and even from what actually happened, we know that on average, those disruptions or those numbers that reflect average disruptions actually are very, very close to what we consider like a good number for estimate that.
Okay. So the second question about, so you put like agriculture and mine construction together. So I see like some people you put mine construction, but I don't know why you also put agriculture in that.
Yeah, we group that because so we have in this survey, we have almost 250 observations, and like after just discussing with the team how we could present the results to make them more understandable in terms of aggregation, right? Because otherwise we were going to end up with 15, 20 different sectors, and it was not going to be representative. So we tried to have discussion on the best way to aggregate this sector, and this was what we consider some feasible approach.
Yeah, like for my construction, like because my company uses equipment, everybody does something like also have focus. So a lot of synergy between my construction.
Yeah.
So agriculture is like different.
Yeah, maybe we consider maybe are more related to primary activities. So so that's why we use, so construction is different from manufacturing too. So we try just to aggregate by this type of yeah, this way.
The first one is of the sectors, like also for like what we can call new features of construction, the previous resilience, like compared to other sectors. I think it is
So in general, when we control for some of this, so this is a econometric estimation that we do to look at the effect of this specific type of decision on the resilience, right? So just sector is one variable that we incorporate. There are other variables that we incorporate, like age in business, right? Or even the size, the number of employees, or there are other variables also, like if the business owned actually the building or not, like different variables that we incorporate and try to control for those to get this estimation.
I'm the odd person out here. So I apologize, I repeat something, my hearing is good, that's other people's hearts, so I repeat a question, just so I can ask, I apologize for that. As a business person, retired business person, surveys are nice. Nice to look at what we can find out from surveys. What I always look for is, how can I use this information?
Yeah.
Otherwise, it doesn't do me any good as a manager. And as a broad-based survey, it's interesting, as a manufacturer, what do I get out of this as far as the results of the survey? So that I can share, for instance, with other people in my industry. What do I learn from the survey?
Okay, so basically, like the surveys, the first two surveys for disasters were designed to compute the cost effectiveness of different actions, like how was the effectiveness versus the cost of each action, right? So we found that different actions aim to maybe different types of industries. Some industries are more likely to implement some actions because are more appropriate than others, right? We also found that it's important to create capabilities related to that for each type of industry and try to extend and try to disseminate this information so can some businesses in some industries learn from others, right? So this is the idea. This is the idea when you run this type of surveys. And it's precisely the same reason when we prepare the survey for COVID, try just to learn from the past how businesses have used strategies in the past and how those strategies helped to cope with the COVID disruption. So.
Okay, so everyone